A report in the Times this morning says ministers are considering a cut to VAT to ease the cost of living crisis. A second report in the Telegraph says the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, wants the government to give teachers a pay rise of as much as 9%. Both measures are suggested as ways to help people cope with high inflation. That's the rate at which prices are rising. But they come amid fears in the Treasury that pay rises or tax cuts could stoke even higher prices in the shops. So what should ministers do? I'm joined now by Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute For Fiscal Studies, an independent research institute into how governments tax and spend. Paul, good to have you with us to talk through all of this. So let's begin with the issue of tax cuts, first of all, and this idea being floated of cutting VAT. Would that, in the long run, help with the cost of living crisis, or would it lead to even higher inflation?
I think there's a danger that it would lead to higher inflation. Clearly, if you cut VAT now, then you will reduce prices in the shop. So supposing we were to reduce VAT by 2.5%, then you'd get a little reduction in prices now. But the whole idea is it would be temporary, so it would go up again in a year or two, so it wouldn't change the long run level of prices. But the exact problem that we're facing at the moment, and this is something that Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, was talking about just yesterday, is that demand is too high. That's partly what's driving up inflation. If you cut VAT now, you push demand high, you probably push inflation higher in the long run. If the government borrows to put more money into the economy today, then that will result in inflation lasting for a longer period of time. And from what we understand, the Treasury is pushing back on this idea. And I have to say, I think the Treasury is dead right on this one.
So it would be a popular move, likely, in the short term, but you think it might come with a sting in the tail?
I think it would be. I think it'd be a terrible policy, if I'm absolutely honest. There's no point mincing words. Cutting VAT now at a time when we've got massive excess demand in the economy. That's partly what's driving up prices. I mean, what you don't want to do when you've got a fire is to throw petrol on it. And actually, we've got a fire at the moment. It's inflation. It's partly driven by very high levels of consumer demand, an economy where we've got very few vacancies and lots of vacancies and very few people looking for work. Everything's pushing prices up. You pour more money into that mixture, and you've got a real danger that you push inflation up further, and that will create just a lot more pain in the long run.
So how do you dampen down that demand, Paul?
Well, the Bank of England, frankly, needs to act more firmly. It's been pushing up interest rates. It's going to continue to push up interest rates. I think, broadly speaking, where the government isn't too far off the right kind of response. It's actually produced some very generous additional payments to particularly people on low incomes, but actually to most people, whilst having some tax rises for higher earners and promising some quite big tax rises down the road. So I think that, broadly speaking, there's not an enormous amount more government can do in this situation without really hurting people a lot further. It's a terribly difficult balancing act between providing support at the moment, not putting too much money into the economy and therefore pushing inflation further, and getting the public finances right.
And speaking of balancing acts, the other part of this story this morning, as we mentioned in the introduction, is that the Education Secretary is asking the Treasury to give teachers pay rises of up to 9%. Strikes very much in the news, ballots in different sectors happening over potential strike action. And clearly, no one wants to see further disruption to education after the disruption of the pandemic. But, the Treasury has been, putting out a very different line, saying, let's not get too carried away with pay increases at this point. So how do you square that circle, Paul?
Well, I think actually there's going to be the most difficult circle of all for the government to square this year. I mean, the problem, teachers face and that a lot of public sector workers face is that their pay today is a lot lower than it was even 10 or 11 years ago. Now, that's pretty much unprecedented in the whole of history. So senior teachers are probably earning 8 to 10% less after you adjust for price inflation than they were in 2010. I mean, that is an extraordinary statement. And we know that in the health service particularly, but also in some teaching jobs, there are lots of vacancies and real problems recruiting people into these kinds of roles. Now, if you only give, as the government suggested to the pay review bodies, 3% pay increases this year, then you're going to be resulting in pay cuts over 12 years of something more like 12 or 15%, which is just extraordinary. And you may be causing more problems with vacancies. So there's a very strong case for giving teachers, nurses, and so on something like inflation-related rises. On the other hand, the amount of money that the Chancellor has made available through the spending review last year would mean that unless he increased that, higher pay rises would mean fewer teachers or fewer nurses, or cutbacks elsewhere. Or if he could fund it through additional borrowing, which again puts more money into the economy. And I think the other thing that probably he's worried about more than probably a relatively small amount of additional money is this giving a signal to people in the private sector for their pay rises? My guess is that in the end, we're going to end up with a compromise where, the teachers get more than the 3%. I think that's implausible that we end up with a 3% pay rise. But I suspect most teachers are not going to get the 9% that Nadhim Zahawi is asking for.
Complicated picture, whichever way you look at it. Paul, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies.